Don't worry too much about this question because genre labels are actually more for publishing than for writing. When you're writing a story, you don't need to exactly label what your story is. Just write what you have in mind. Once you're done, your publisher will either put the label of science fiction or fantasy on the cover, depending on what they think will sell more. Genre labels are for selling books. They're not a defining characteristic of a book itself. You can find plenty of novels which, upon reading, you might find, hey, this seems like science fiction or this seems like fantasy. But the authors don't call them either of those things. They call them literary fiction for some reason that I don't understand. So if your story contains robots or spaceships or black holes, your publisher or even your readers might consider it science fiction. If your story contains golems and portals and kingdoms and magic wands, then your publisher and your readers might consider it a fantasy story. Maybe even you want to call your story by those names, and that's okay. But it's also okay if you don't call it by any name and you just write a story that you have in your head and then worry about genre labels later on because that is where they belong. They belong at a later point of time in the process of the creation of your story. I feel like a lot of people who ask this question about whether their story is science fiction or fantasy are perhaps under the impression that there are some things they can't do if their story is science fiction, and that there are some things they can't do if their story is fantasy. They seem to think that fantasy exists in this world and it is allowed to do this, this, and this, and science fiction is allowed to do all those things that fantasy can't do. This is a limiting belief in many cases because some of the best stories I've read are a mix of both. Because trust me, it is never going to happen that you submit a story and say this is a fantasy story, and the publisher says, "What? You said fantasy, but this has spaceships. Your book is rejected." That's not going to happen. At most, they might suggest that you label it something different. Whether your story gets accepted or rejected depends on the quality of the story, not the label you put on it.